Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So we're here today with Dr. Richard Drass, and he's with the Oklahoma Archeological Society. Survey, sorry, at OU. And I met him about 10 years ago, probably, when I started grad school. And I collected Indian artifacts for a long time and was always interested in it, which was a good thing for me that the OAS was just across campus. So I was able to take all the stuff I had questions about and bug them with it, and got to know them and found that they were pretty helpful and friendly, and thought it was a good experience for me, and that's kind of led up to inviting them down here to give talks, or up here, I guess. And today he's going to give us a talk about a Wichita Village on the Red River called the Longest Site. And I guess I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Yeah, we do research all over Oklahoma on prehistoric and early historic sites. And one of the things I've been interested in is the plains, the western half of Oklahoma, and the native societies that existed there in the past and developed into historic tribes that we know today. And there are a variety of them, and one of the main ones that dates back into prehistory that we can trace back at least 1,000 years is the Wichita. And they're still a group in Oklahoma today, and we deal with the Wichita quite a bit. So a lot of the sites, especially in the western half of Oklahoma, deal with Wichita groups that were around from 1,000 years or more ago to now. And along with that, you look in. I've started out in prehistoric villages that before Coronado or anybody was here, and looking at how they adapted and lived. And then I continued on up, and we were able to trace some sites that were actually early historic contacts with the first Europeans that were coming into the area, specifically the Spanish and the French. So if you look at the earliest historic documents we got are from those. The Coronado came through 1541-42, another Spaniard in 1601, and Lahart came up from Louisiana to near Tulsa and met Wichita groups in 1719. Well, those are all good identifications, but they're really brief, and the historic documentation on them isn't very much. So we've been working on some sites up here in the Arkansas River that date to the early 1700s. Have a few French traders coming and going in, and some record of it. But really, it's only until the mid-1700s on that we get very much historic documentation of what the Wichita life was like back in that period and how they interacted with the Europeans they met. And we have a site down here on the Red River called the Longest Site. The people that I've actually been studying up here moved down to the Red River in the mid-1750s. And from about 1755 till 1811 or even later, they lived at this big village. As it turns out, there were numerous traders and other people coming in here, so we have records from 1750s to 1811 of what was going on at this village in Spanish and French and American and English contact in the area. We're primarily French, but there are also all these other people coming in. So what I like to view this as is the first really historic town in Oklahoma, and it's a Wichita village. It was established by the Wichita. There's a fortification there established and documented historically. Houses, farming, all that's going on in this village, and they're trading with Europeans like the French, trading with other Indian groups like the Comanche out on the plains, and Apache. Well, they didn't trade with the Apache too much, but they had contact with them, and the Caddo in the east. So what I want to talk about today is what we know about this site and what we're currently studying on it, and what we're doing recent work on it. We're going to go down there in May and do some more excavations at the site. It appears on many of the early maps. This is a map from 1823, which is actually a pretty good location for the village, and it's called the Tobiah Village there, and that's a sub-tribe of the Wichita. And there's actually a couple other Wichita villages along the Red River there. By the 1750s, this is the Red River. Most of the Wichita had already moved into northern Texas. There were tribes, various sub-tribes of the Wichita living at Waco and in eastern Texas, and on several places along the Red River. by that time, most of Oklahoma, especially the northern part of it, had been abandoned by the Wichita for various reasons I'll talk about. But we have a number of sites where we got evidence that the Wichita were there, but this is one of the earliest sites that shows up repeatedly on the early maps because it was one of the best recorded. Interestingly, there's at least 5 or 6 major periods where we have people actually writing down journals about what's going on at the Wichita sites. And the Spanish in Santa Fe wanted to make a connection between that and Nacogdoches down in the western eastern part of Texas, right across from Nacogdoches, Louisiana, on the Red River. So this guy Vial, he had already traversed down into Texas to San Antonio, so they asked him to make a route from San Antonio to Nacogdoches. And he came down the Canadian, then dropped to the Red River and went down into Nacogdoches. Well, that's pretty good, but he came to this village of the longest site on the Red River and recorded it and recorded just a little bit of stuff about it. But interestingly enough, he records the Comanche there, other groups there, and that these people living at the longest site actually talk about originating up on the Arkansas River, the sites we've been looking at up there, and moving down here in the 1750s. So we actually have historic documentation of them being up in a place that's not well documented historically. The other neat thing about Longest is it's one of the first battle sites in Oklahoma or in northern Texas, because the Spanish attacked this village in 1759. And the Spanish had a pretty good reason for attacking the village, because the longest site's up here. Down here northwest of Austin was a mission called San Saba Mission, and it had a presidio or a fort nearby. And it was designed, the mission was designed to bring the Apache in and Christianize them and make them a sedentary group rather than a, quote, savage group. So that's what they were trying to do. The only problem with this is the Comanche and Wichita were big-time allies at most of this period. They were the enemies of the Apache, and that they thought the Apache were getting an advantage by being that close to the Europeans, in this case the Spanish. In 1758, several large groups came down to San Saba, Michigan, near Menard, Texas, and sacked the mission, killing most of the people there, including several priests. And the presidio was cut off and unable to assist with it because they had put the presidio, a fort, about a mile and a half away, too far to reach it safely. The reason they put it that far away is they didn't want the Apache to be intimidated by the soldiers. Well, they only had about 40 or 50 soldiers there anyway. So they pretty much destroyed that mission, and that hurt the Spanish pride significantly, as you might expect. So they decided to take an expedition to the longest site, and in 1759, the next year, they took off for that. And on October 7th, I think it was, in that year, they attacked the Wichita site at the longest. So it has a neat record there, really at the earliest, near the early time it was occupied. The Spanish are great at recording things. A king wanted to know every detail, so they always made many notes on what they were doing. A guy actually kept a journal on this expedition specifically to report back. So we got quite a few details of the site. They came up from the San Saba mission. They collected soldiers from other forts in the area near missions, and also militia, which translates into farmers and everyday workers that they could get to come along, and some other Indian allies and Apache allies. The state in the report says they had about 500 soldiers, quote, that includes the militia, plus 150, that includes the militia and friendly Indians that they were longtime allies with, and the Apache had about 150 warriors with them. So you're going to trek up about 250 miles or more, up on horseback from western Texas to the Red River. What do you got to do? You got to take food, supplies, ammunition with you. They had about 1,500 horses to go with them. They had, I don't remember, 1,000 cattle, sheep, or goats, various other things that they took with them for food. It took them, they left in late August or early September, I can't remember, and turned around and came back in early November to the mission in San Saba. So they were gone for a couple months. So you can imagine this expedition of 500 soldiers, some other Indians, and horses and cattle all being taken up on a trail towards the Red River for 250 plus miles. It must have been quite a sight to see. The description is a fortified village of the Wichita with other villages nearby, and we have a number of different descriptions. They have descriptions of field that were along the Red River bottom, growing corn, beans, squash, watermelon, which was brought in by the Spanish, and some other crops, tobacco. And then they have a description of the village, including corrals for horses that were stockaded, the Comanche Camp, and a little bit about what's going on inside the fort. Later visitors give us a better idea what the inside of the fort looks like because the Spanish never got there. They got inside it. Okay, so what we're looking at, 1750s. There's a couple of pair villages up on the Arkansas River near the Kansas border, and they moved south to a pair of villages on the Red River, one of them in Texas, and the main one, the first site recorded in Jefferson County, Oklahoma, called the longest site. All these sites in red are sites that have fortification in the 1700s or before. Most of these out in western Oklahoma had forts in the 1500s. But what does that tell us? That tells us that the Wichita were building forts before there was European contact in the area. Now the reason they were building forts is because the Apache and other enemies were out in this area and they needed to defend themselves against some intrusions. The Apache were moving down in the 1500s. So you'll see in Spanish reports they attribute a lot of the fortification, aspects of the fortification to the French, but we know from some excavations out in western Oklahoma and Texas that they had been building forts similar to this a couple hundred years before. Down at the longest side in the Red River, we have the earliest maps we have are 1873 and 1898. In 1873, the river in this area runs north-south and then turns back east. The site sits on a high terrace. Notice that although it's gridded off, all there are trees and nothing. In 1898, this whole area that's hatched here is cultivated. Somebody settled in the area and is growing crops. So white settlement in 1890, by 1898 has cultivated the whole area, including the site we now know as longest. The site sits on this high terrace and looks out to the west over the Red River. If you look at it on a topo map of the same period, this is the terrace. The river would have run somewhere right below it. You can see these little black dots, including on the site, are homesteads that were in there by 1898. I want to mention the town of Spanish Fort over here. The other Wichita villages along this creek and about this area. So they could look right across the river at their allies on the other side. Supposedly there's another Wichita village downstream from this that was nearby and came to the assistance, but it's not been found yet. There's the modern Google of the site. The site extends from about here to here, which is about a half a mile, maybe a little more. Along the edge of the terrace, we're looking west over this way. This little creek divides the site in half. There are springs along the terrace and the creek, so it was a nice high setting, good defendable setting. Had good access to water and very sandy soils that were probably fairly productive, plus the bottomland soils that they could cultivate. Okay, the first excavations at longest are actually in 65 to 67, and the site was known since the 1950s at least. Excavations, as you can see, they've removed the plows on and got down into the features and stuff. This is actually all these little sticks in there marked post molds where there was a house or some other structure there. I don't think it was a house, but we're looking towards the edge of the bluff, which is over in this tree line. As such a large site, they tested quite a bit of it for 2 years, but they only tested a fraction of it. And this is across the river. They did the same thing on the Texas side. This is an aerial of some of the excavations there. They did not find a lot of occupation related to this time period. Most of what we're looking here is an earlier occupation dating to about 1400, 1500 years ago. In the Oklahoma side, and this is a 1967, 66 aerial, the site is primarily in this area. You're looking at the north half and about the same amount down here to the south. You can see the river. Note this sandbar here in the low flat setting. We're up 50 feet above the river in this terrace, and then you don't get up that high until way over here where the other Wichita Village would have been. This is what it looks like today in 2009. It's a wheat field most of the time in the winter and spring. The landowners live on the north side of the site. And I have a view of the river looking north, and I have that sandbar pointed out. The reason I point out the sandbar is the Spanish attack. The Wichita knew the Spanish were coming, and they led the Spanish through thickets and trees with the road was through it, right down onto a sandbar near the site. The Spanish could not get across the river very easily. It was about 6 foot deep, they said. Up the steep banks to the site was difficult because it was defended by the Indians on horseback and foot. And not only that, this sand is so dense that it makes horses slow down and people can slug through it very fast. And so the Indians had a plan of drawing them in here and then cutting them off and annihilating them. They didn't annihilate the Spanish, as we'll see, but they did successfully cut off the attack. In '65, they put large trenches through the area looking for features such as pits, houses, fortifications, things like that. And then you can see that sandy soil in there. They found house structures, and what we look at when we're looking for an excavated house is, in this case, it's dug down about a foot below the surface, so you can see this depression they put the house in. These are post molds that would have supported the walls and roof. And then in the center is a hearth for where they kept their fire going all the time. You cannot tell the door. There's a couple of storage pits on one side. The doors are usually north-south, or sometimes all 4 directions, east, west, north, south. And there's grinding basins and other things on the floor of this structure. It would have looked like, there's another view of it from a different angle. This is a typical Wichita beehive-shaped house that they still occupied into the 1900s. And here's one of their doors. Usually previously they were probably hide covered. Notice that there's an arbor outside of it. We think there were arbors outside of most houses because in the summer this is where the Wichita would spend all of their time rather than inside this hot house. There's more or less rounded or slightly peaked at the top and a smoke hole up here. And this is grass thatch that forms the wall, nice long grass. And the storage pits, there's numerous. If you have people living at a site for 40, 50, 60 years, you're going to get a lot of storage facilities, and that's what most of these pits are. They're dug down about 3 or 4 feet, and they come down for a while straight, then they bail out at the bottom so that you can cap the top and seal them and also hide them if you're going out. Most of the village is going out on a buffalo, you can store your supplies in there, not worry about them too much. This is a common feature at the site. They often get filled with trash, so we are interested in what's thrown away at archaeological sites, and that's where we look for material. In terms of the artifacts, we get a great variety of artifacts. We get the native-made technology. They're still making their own tools, but they're also trading with Europeans who are bringing in lots of material that comes into the site. Why would the Europeans, especially the French, trade with the Wichita? Anybody have an idea? What would the Wichita have that they wanted?
Like buffalo hides?
Buffalo hides, excellent. Buffalo hides and meat. The French had New Orleans was their nearest major town, but at Nacogdoches, Louisiana, they had a trading post. On the junction of the Arkansas and Mississippi, they had a trading post. Most of the material went down the Red River to New Orleans eventually. Trade goods came up to Nacogdoches and then over into the plains, and this village and the longest site was one of the major trade centers. Material comes into the longest site. We'll talk about what they're trading in, and then they trade it to the Comanche and other groups for more bison hides and meat, and that goes downriver. The bison hide, the meat stops in the colonies in Louisiana, primarily. Most of the bison hides are shipped over to Europe, and they're where they're in fashion for everything from hats to chairs to machinery for industrial technology that's starting to go. flooring and wall covers, all this kind of stuff. The bison hides were fueling a big market in Europe, not just France, but all across Europe. Okay, so the technology has a combination of European trade items and native. One of the main things we see on the Arkansas River where we come from are these scrapers that are used to process and scrape off flesh from bison hides. This is the whole collection from the longest site down here of the flint or chert scrapers. I think by the time they move down here, there's a couple things going on. They become middlemen where they're trading for hides and meat, and also they're moving more towards metal tools, even though these flint scrapers are actually better than the metal tools in terms of scraping hides. So we also get some of this is made out of material from up there on the Arkansas River, so they were bringing it down with them in the 1750s. And then they were getting other cherts and flints from Texas. We see a variety of things again in technology. These are pipes. Tobacco was an important thing. The calumet ceremony, where you meet and greet people and can interact without killing each other, pipes became an important in that ceremony. There's these native-made clay pipes, and some of them are made out of stone, where they're made by the native groups. And then we get these catlinite or red pipestone pipes that are made by groups or originate from up in Minnesota in the Pipestone National Monument and are traded all the way down. And the interesting thing of these pipes, these particular ones here, this is one pipe actually, is that the engraving is inlaid with lead. And there's lead sprues on some of the pipes. Here's another one with lead and lead sprue on the end. So that's a metal technology that the French and Europeans brought in and added to decoration and technology on the pipes. So you have a mixture there, but mostly they're native-made pipes. Interestingly, about this period, the Wichita were growing their own tobacco, but they started trading tobacco that the French were growing in the Caribbean, and it begins to replace the tobacco that we see at Wichita sites at this time and earlier. Pottery, they're still making some pottery here. This is the only fairly complete vessel from that 1965, 6, and 7 excavations. And it has a little incised design on it. It doesn't fit our typology, but its shape is similar to stuff we saw up on the Arkansas River. And there are a lot of decorated sherds that are not the native pottery we see at most Wichita sites, but at Caddo sites to the east in eastern Texas and southeast Oklahoma. And a lot of it has decorations and polish on it in its bowls. Some of it's got red slip. Much different from what we usually see in the everyday pottery for cooking and stuff at the Wichita. So actually, as it turns out, there's very little native pottery, again, at longest compared to earlier sites. They're moving towards the metal kettles, I think, that are much easier to get from the trade here. Another ceramic that we see frequently and becomes more apparent at this site is figurines. Some of these are faces and human, obviously some of them are human. This is the body of a horse probably, because sticks could be stuck in for legs. And this is for sure a broken head from a horse. Horses are fairly common, and there's actually been a human shape with the legs splayed out like they were set on a horse. So a rider for a horse was manufactured from clay. These are small figurines. As far as we know, they don't have any ceremonial importance, but they may have at different times. There's some question about whether some of these that look like faces are actually birds. Owls are important in Wichita mythology, and so there's some of them may be owl figurines. A couple figurines from up on the Arkansas River are owl figurines. So, interesting thing we see. The stone arrow points are still in use, but we get lots of points made out of metal. Iron and copper or brass are pounded into and shaped into. And actually, these ones with the corner spalls are probably made by the French and traded into the Indians. They were making their own about up to this time and even a little later. But they started, French, anything they could trade and make and trade, they did. And they started reproducing and mass producing metal points for the Indian groups by the 1800s, most of them were traded in. But The other thing we see at this time period is guns have become more common. The Wichita didn't get their guns until the early 1700s. By 1755, when the Spanish attacked this village, they talk about them being well armed with lots of ammunition and being closer to the French. The French were the Europeans that traded guns to most Indian groups. The Spanish would not trade weapons with Native American groups. We see lead balls and gun parts at most of these. We've done some studies of where the lead was made. The French started lead mines in southern Missouri soon after they were in the area. And so we have both lead from Europe and lead from those Missouri mines identified. Unfortunately, from longest, we have not sourced any of the lead from there yet. Well, we don't want to see gun flints, I guess. Most of the guns are black, all the guns are black powder at this time. So pistols and rifles are black powder weapons. They require gun flints. Sorry about that, didn't turn it off. The gun flints are what the trigger hits to spark the black powder that sets off the powder in the rifle. Gun flints are interesting. We actually have a student working on that now because they're made both by the native groups and they're shipped in by the French to replace gun flints that are worn out. At the longest site, these are all French-made gun flints. They're made from chert that's in France. We have some black chert that's made from England, and some of these are French also. These dark colored ones are from England, and then there's some native made from local church. So they were trading and making their own. If you're going to replace, Indians could nap a gun flint in a few minutes. So if they needed to replace it, they had no problem, but the French were trading them in all the time. Up in the Arkansas River sites, we get almost all native-made gun flints earlier, but now they're getting more and more trade items, which is an interesting change. And the gun parts show up quite frequently. This is the barrel of a gun. When they get worn out, metal technology is still fairly new to them, and they use them for other things. The gun barrels, most of them are crushed on the barrel end and used for prying or stakes or something different than a gun barrel. There are lots of pieces of guns. Gun decorations show up, all kinds of parts. You can tell where the guns were made. Most of them are French, but English guns show up. American guns show up sometimes. This is an interesting lion decoration that's been found at longest because the lion symbol was a common symbol for English guns. So you might say this came from an English gun, but in around the Civil War and after, I mean not Civil War, the Revolutionary War and after, there was a man in Pennsylvania that was making guns, and he actually liked to use a lion symbol on his gun. So all we can say is this symbol is either an English gun or it came from Pennsylvania, American trade. They still make those guns today with these symbols on them for black powder. They're considered, I can't remember the guy's name, I think it was Bradman that started it, but they're still considered well-made those Pennsylvania-made guns, and they're still used today, still made today. But the other thing is English ones are often a rear-end line, but not always. So we can't say for sure, but it's interesting that you can get American or French traders in there. I mean, English traders. Lots of metal shows up at sites. All kinds of metal, which is new to the technology of the Wichita Indians in the 1700s, by mid-1700s, 1800s. They're using it for all kinds of stuff, bracelets, buttons. This is a really deteriorated axe. Hose are traded in. Pendants. These are tinklers. They're rolled copper or brass metal that you string on strings and put on your clothing to make tinkling noises. So they're real common in the assemblies. All kinds of metal stuff. Here's a collector's, one tray of collection from the longest site. Iron punches or awls are in there often. Triggers of guns, bracelets, arrow points, tinklers, you name it. Figurines, rings, gun flints, all kinds of stuff show up in the collections from the longest, from the surface and the excavations. And some more ornate decorations from guns down there at the bottom. And glass. I don't know why I can't get that. My light's gone out. Anyway, the glass trade beads are a real common item that we see at this time. I've gone to some black and white pictures from the report because I didn't have access to these right now. But these are native-made tools now that we see real common early, all through late prehistory into the protostory. These are shaft abraders, and what they're used is kind of the sandpaper of prehistory. When you make your arrow shafts, you run them through there to get them real smooth, and it sands them down. They're usually that triangular, rectangular shape with a groove in the middle. Bone tools are still used. And it sounds strange when you got metal tools and things going on, but these are actually digging tools made from bison shoulder blades, scapulas, and bison long bones. They're probably still used in agricultural activities, hoeing corn and various other stuff. We do have metal axes shown up. They may be for more intensive digging like fortifications and pits and stuff, but they could be used in farming activity. And then there's other types of tools that are used for like shucking corn or removing the skin from squash and various other activities. I mentioned the glass trade beads. They're kind of usually fairly small. Get anywhere blue, reds, but whites and blues are real common. You get kind of a greenish tint. You can tell their bead styles change through time, so you can tell roughly the age of a site by what types of beads are showing up. So the beads in this basically match what we expect in the 1750 to 1800 time period, but all these types of beads were also used a little earlier, so we see them up in the Arkansas River. I mentioned that they were growing crops. These were out in the plains, but these Wichita were a sedentary group. They had permanent villages like what I'm talking about, and they depended on corn and beans and squash primarily. And they hunted bison and deer for their economy, whereas the Comanche, their allies, were primarily mobile groups all the time. And once they got the horse in the 1700s, they were even more mobile. And so they would trade to the Wichita and other groups if they could find them for corn and other crops. And so finding the description of crops down near the battlefield during the Spanish attack is not surprising. We have almost no analysis. They didn't collect plant remains too much during the 65, 66, so there's only a few remains found. And we haven't analyzed the bone, but it's mostly bison bone from the site. Lots of deer. Okay. So I want to talk about what we're interested in now. They did a lot of stuff on houses and pits and stuff. Okay, didn't want to go there. But I'm interested in the fortification because we've excavated parts of a fortification up on the Arkansas River that were described in about one sentence by the French. We went through Wichita Village with forts. Okay, that's a good description. That gives you a good picture, doesn't it? But we have a good description of the Wichita fort at the longest site from that attack and from later visitors to the site. And they talk about fortification. They dug a moat, piled the dirt in the inside, built a stockade on it, and and that's their main fortification. Had an entryway that was stockaded, zigzagging down that steep terrace. I'll show you what we think is going on, and to the Red River. Well, as we found out when we looked for this entryway on that terrace, it goes right over a spring. So you have access to a water inside that stockaded entryway. Zigzag keeps anybody from charging up there on horseback and getting into your fort. The wooden stockade allows you to fire from inside while being protected, and the moat keeps horses from coming in and charging the fort. So we have all these good aspects that date back to 1500, before horses were present, but a similar type of fortification in western Oklahoma appears on a smaller scale in 1500. They tell us in some details about the size of the site and the height of the stockade, how deep they were burying it and putting the posts and various other things. And then they have things about inside the fort, subterranean apartments I'll talk about in a minute because that's kind of interesting. And then there are several later ones that talk about the forts as being slender construction. I don't think they changed. I think their view of them changed because they weren't kept up very well in the late 1800s. By 1834, maybe within 30 years after this place was abandoned, the dragoons visited the village in the Wichita Mountains in southwest Oklahoma. and did not record any fortifications at that time. And another village near Rush Springs was visited several times in the 1830s, and no fortification was there. There may have been a fortification in a village which is at where Fort Sill is now, but that's not real clear, and it's never been found or excavated. So we know that they're disappearing in the mid-1800s, but up until this time, we've got this. That makes longest, but basically the main one we have a description of, and the only one with much description. And here's that drawing somebody made in the 1960s about the Spanish attack. The Spanish came up through on a path through the wooded area down to one of those nice low sandy terrace, sandy benches right below the fortification. And basically that was the plan. The villagers would come out on horseback on either side, try to cut them off there, and we're going to try to end them, and they could also fire down onto the Spanish. The Spanish brought 2 small cannons, which can't fire small shot or a small ball. After they were frustrated about getting anywhere and couldn't, this attack started in the late morning and went all day until evening, which in October is not too late, but at 4 or 5 hours. The Spanish brought the small cannons into the sand, fired 11 shots at the fortification up there, and the Indians laughed at them. It had no effect at all. They ended up losing those 2 cannons because they had to retreat and couldn't get them out of that sandy area in the wooded area nearby. The extended entryway is depicted here, and the steep terrace, there's only a couple routes up it on the description of the Spanish attack. The other thing is, I've pointed out here, is that this depiction shows no subterranean apartments inside. The subterranean apartments were described as places where the non-combatants went when the battles came. So women, children, whatever went in there, and supplies were kept in there. So they were partially or all underground. And that makes an interesting thing because your fort is made above ground, obviously. There were also reports of some houses inside the fort, but much of the village is outside of the fort, including the stockade for the horses and the Comanche Camp. Okay, come on. I must be running the battery again. Today, in the 1960s, 67, when they did the excavation, they did not find the fort during the main excavation. In 67, they deep plowed this area. They didn't intend to get it plowed that deep. And you can see this oval ring in here of white. That's when they plowed up a whole bunch of bison bone. And that's why it shows up white. Pieces of bison bone were thrown in the fortification ditch, and it makes a nice oval shape. It's about 120 yards by 80 yards. It's a fair-sized fortification. This is the edge of the terrace going down, and this is, I think, where the entryway zigs down. It's now an eroded area, and I think it's eroded because they went down that slope so much it created erosion. If you get another view of it, again, you can see the white banding, edges of the fortification and the entryway. The river's right down here. We've got at least 50 feet drop down there. It's a nice, defendable place. There's looking up the terrace from the bottom, pretty steep. I should have a person standing up, it would be fairly small up here. This is, you can't see it very well, but there's spring about halfway down that slope on the entryway erosional area. So they had access to water, as I mentioned. And then in 1967, they only cross-sectioned it with one ditch to find the fortification ditch, the moat that was around the fortification, and they did find that. Go ahead. And here's the map they made based on the bones distribution in the surface, where they tested it. And notice they didn't excavate it, but they hit a feature they could see on the surface and in their squares that they described as a structure. I think they hit into one of their subterranean structures, but they didn't excavate in 67. Okay? Well, just to look at it, here's the trench. If you're looking down at it, here's the trench. There was a pit outside of it, and then another subterranean feature in there. So that's the moat, or the ditch, that was around the fort. It goes up and down. And this is something else that they didn't investigate. And there's their profile of it. The reason I show this is, in a typical profile, you hit subsoil in this area. This is full of layers of trash and soil that have eroded in, charcoal, bone, pieces of pottery are in the fill of the ditch where they're throwing it while they occupy the site, and it becomes filled with it pretty much. And that's why we see a lot of artifacts coming up in there. Go ahead. Right now, we're planning, as I mentioned, excavations in May to do more work around the fortification area, since that was not done much in it. In fact, that was the only excavation, was that little trench you saw in the fort area. We've done, to do that today, now you can look underground, basically with things like magnetics, electrical resistivity, radar, subsurface radar. So here's this, they're using radar in this picture to look at what's underground in the fort area. And we can see that ditch in its shape underground like they could in '67 when they plowed it and they could see it on the surface. We can see it in the ground. There's sometimes some indication of where the dirt was piled up. It's harder to see because it's all been plowed down, but the ditch is still there. And the magnetics show similar things. They show ditches and things like that. And you can get an idea where to dig without going in blindly looking for a trench. So in '67 they didn't know where it was until it accidentally showed up. We obviously knew where it was because they found it in '67, but we could go in there and do a lot more detail on the features that are inside the fort and outside of it, and how it's made and constructed. And what we want to do in May is go in there and see if what we're looking at on those maps, radar and magnetics, is what it appears to be: entryways, subterranean apartments, houses, whatever. This is an example. The fort area, we've gridded off 30 meter squares, or 30 yards, 30 meters. This is the fort as it was found in '67, and they tested it over here. This, again, is the same area of the fort, and if you could see it very good, you could see it coming around here. And actually, we've improved this now. We've done these grids. You can see some lines in there. All these lines that parallel are the plow zone, so we can take those out. Modern plow zone. But there's a big dark circle in this area. This big bright spot is an iron stake, probably left from the excavations in '67. There's a black area here, about 10 meters in diameter, which is a nice house size, perfectly round. I think that's a burned Wichita house there. And it's burned. Why I think it's burned is because it's so dark on the magnetics. This is the magnetics. All these black and white things are metal. And unfortunately, there was an 1898 Homestead right in here. And those are modern, what quote modern metal, 1900, turn of the 1900s to 2000. 1800s and 1900s. So most of that is disturbance more recently. But the fort, I think, underlies it, still exists. And it's basically running in these squares, and we haven't even got the radar back yet. So it's going to be quite detailed. You can see they had excavations out west, and they also excavated in this area some. They totally missed the fort except for that one trench. Let's go to the next one. Here I've got the same thing marked. Here's the metal spike from the. Here's this big feature round. Here's the house. This, remember, each of these is 30 meters or 30 yards. This is over 40 yards in diameter. I have no idea what that is. And it's inside and outside the fort. The fort crosses right through here. Here's where they dug it into. The fort comes right down through here. Well, one thing we'll test is, what is this? Why is it known? And anything that's straight or round like that is usually not natural. And you can see most of the magnetics don't show that kind of thing. Again, metal shows up, but the ditches show up pretty good, and we've drawn features on here. Here's the big one. There's some other trenches, and now we have several things going on down here. There may be another entryway here. The entryway supposedly faced the river, went down this way, but there's multiple ditches down here. So what we're going to be looking at is we're looking for ditches that indicate where the subterranean structure and the fort moat were. We're looking for entryways with post patterns or ditches that overlap, maybe made it difficult for people to attack by coming straight in. We don't know, the description's not good enough for many of the descriptions, although they're better than any other site we've got. So we're going to look at that fortification. There's a number of features inside, probably pits and hearths inside, that we probably won't get to test this summer, but we're going to get a number of things that give us an idea of how this fort compares to the one we've excavated on the Red River. And the one we've excavated on, the Arkansas River, the one from the Arkansas River, the people that moved down there, we've excavated part of one of those subterranean structures. In this case, the white area is the ditch. It has straight sides. It's about 15 feet across, 3 feet down or so. And at the bottom on the floor of this trench, posts were dug down another 3 feet to hold up a structure over it, which was a grass thatch roof, kind of what they put on their houses. Might have covered it with soil to protect it. So the house, so it was semi-subterranean, about 3 feet deep, and then the roof comes up over from the ground. And it probably was covered with dirt. We find grass clinkers, which are burned silica from grass thatch in the floor. The structure burned, but there was nothing on the floor of it when it burned, so that probably was intentionally burned after they used it for some reason. There's trash in the fill of the trench after they were still living there. And then we happen to hit an area, this trench goes all the way around the fort on the inside. There's this little room off of it. And it has 4 center posts and a hearth in the bottom. It's almost like you'd find the pattern for one of those houses we saw a picture of, a nice round. But it's 3 feet deep down, and it's attached to the trench. Nobody describes that. I don't know if it occurs down along the side or not. So that's a new feature at the Arkansas site that we'll be looking for on the magnetics and radar down there, but it's not described anywhere in the literature, the small amount of historic descriptions we have. So we're looking for at least this part as what we'll find at the Red River as they describe as subterranean apartments. One thing we definitely want to look for. Okay, so we've got Wichita were making forts in the 1700s, maybe a little earlier, late 1600s, but earlier Wichita groups that were before contact were making smaller forts as something similar. The big ones we see in the 18th century, the 1700s, are circular or oval in shape, and they usually have some kind of entryway, often a protected entryway that's stockaded. They're larger in diameter, I already mentioned. They run 120 yards or so, and some of them are 150. The ones up there at the site in the Arkansas we're working, the outside ditches are 150 meters apart, which is yards, about the same thing. There are multiple ditches up on the, multiple moats up on the, there's 3 different moats up on the Arkansas River one. I don't think there are on the longest one, but that's one thing we're looking for. Were they rebuilding the fort periodically? They all have embankments at some time and would have had stockades if we can find the posts for them, but most of these are clout, so it's difficult to. And then the interior ditches. They're roughly centered in the villages, often centered in the villages, and they have water access, either from the entryway or inside the fortification. Seems to be important, and if you're defending yourself under an assault, you want access to water probably for some period of time. And we mentioned the interior structures. We hope to see what they look like at the longest. One more, I think. No, 2 more. This is the village up on the Arkansas River, and the yellow is the subterranean structure. That's about 100 yards across. We've dug in it, the big part we dug in it is here. This is a plowed field, this is a plowed field, this has never been plowed. And we've dug several tests in here. That won't go off. I don't want to talk to you. Okay, sorry. These red ones are the 3 outer moat ones. And the magnetics show up best up here. We've tested down here. So we're pretty sure of the location of this. Our entryways are problems. There's a bluff to the river right here that drops about 70 feet in the Arkansas River bottom. There's a draw that starts in the center right here, comes down through the fort. This, I think, was their water source, although it's dry today. It was probably dammed up for water source at that time. I can't think why else you'd build it around a little dry creek, a draw there. And we also recently think we have an entryway that comes out here. We have the edge of one of these forts that we haven't confirmed. We don't have enough excavated to know if there's a zigzag or what kind of entryway to block easy access. But it's not too far from this high bluff edge, so you're worried about attacks from this side mostly. People aren't going to come up that bluff too easily, too fast. It's fairly steep. Anyway, there is an entryway on this side. There could have been an entryway up this gully into this. Most of this area is in trees and eroded, so we don't know too much about this, but we've tested in a number of places up here. One interesting thing about this, every one of these ditches was filled when the site was occupied, because when we uncovered parts of them, we found pits that were dug into the filled-in ditch. So I've got a fort that every ditch was filled while they were living there. These people were up here were under attack by the Osage, primarily, but other groups. And eventually they attacked the Osage, but they were under heavy pressure. One of the reasons they moved to the Red River was the Osage. I don't think they'd live here without a fort. So there's either another fort at this site or another moat and ditch out here somewhere that we haven't found yet. So we've got 4 ditches down here that we've identified. We've been working on this site for 10 years, so off and on. So, it's one of the major villages up on the Arkansas. So anyway, that gives you an idea of what complexity of a fort. I don't think the Red River one has this many ditches in it, but it should have one of these subterranean ones and at least a moat, one moat. And now the last one. And there's Catlin's view of the village at Devil's Canyon in southwest Oklahoma. Notice there's no fort. They have fencing around. These would be cornfields and stuff. However, you know Catlin, the artist, the Western artist, he went out with the dragoons on this expedition, but he never got to this village, actually. He got sick. So he drew the village descriptions from the soldiers who came back and told him. That's why these houses have chimneys on them. There's no chimneys on those Wichita grass thatch houses. But there were fences around fields and other attributes that you can see in this large village. This is where one of the places they went not long after Longest was abandoned, within 10 to 15 years of it. So the Wichita were living a similar life, but no evidence of fortifications at this site. Of course, you're protected on mountains on one side and the North Fork of the Red River on the other side, but still, it's interesting that they're not showing up after 1830. So we have a lot we're going to do down on the Red River for a couple weeks in the end of May, and get started down there trying to sort out what the Wichita were doing, building forts and how they did them, and what features they used in their defenses. The result, I should tell you the result, the Spanish were routed, never got anywhere near the fort, and went back to the missions and then eventually San Antonio, and never attacked the Wichita again. The 2 cannons that were lost were kept by the Wichita for about 10 years. Then they got on peaceful coexistence again, and they gave them back to the Spanish. So the Spanish never tried to attack the village again. Most of northern Texas was not settled or not missionized by the Spanish. They were primarily in the southern half of Texas, and mostly in the west in that area too. So the Wichita and the Comanche allies and others in that area had pretty much control of what went on in that area of North Texas, southern Oklahoma, in the late 1700s to early 1800s. And that's basically a little bit about a town in southern Oklahoma that may be our earliest historic site. Any questions? It's all clear as mud? No? That's all I have.
Let's give him a round of applause.
I had a question about the Red River, and of course it's an older river, and so there are a lot of meanders. Have you looked for like caches hidden in the meanders or in what Like now be sandbars, but may not have been in the past?
Yeah, the problem with with that low on the river, I showed you that sandbar. It probably, I mean, well, I don't think that was the one because the river, I've seen aerial photos at different times and the river has moved. Right now, it's probably, the Spanish describe it as right below the village, which is almost where it is right now. But it could move, that Texas side is low, so it has a wide flood area that it can move. And there's been a number of, well, in the 50s, I think in the 80s, and then maybe in the 90s, there were some big floods down there that the river moved. Now, that bank that the site sets on that high terrace, that 50-foot high terrace, that whole thing makes the river go south there. And for about 2 or 3 miles, or however long it is, it goes south and then it turns back east. But it does the same thing in several areas as you go down the Red River. You can go another 15 miles due west, and the river will be going north again for a while, and then turn west. So it is a lot of meandering. Unfortunately, that bottom has been subject to so much. I mean, I'd love to go down there and see an old field that they laid out and what they did on an agricultural field, never been discovered. We know they were growing in and around villages, but let alone caches and things like that. Now, the small creek that goes up through the site, they found some caches of stuff excavated in there, mostly by amateurs that are looking around. It's been probably collected since it was broke out in the plow in the 1890s. So, there's some huge collections, surface collections from it. But the relationship of the material and the other houses and stuff, and where the Comanche Camp, for instance, is on that one little picture. It'd be interesting to know if that's where it was. It'd be harder to find a Comanche camp because they're usually teepees or tents, and so they're going to be distinguished by, smaller footprints in the ground, and also just posts that sometimes don't go very deep. So if your plowing goes a foot deep, unless those posts went deeper or the soil filled up, there are post molds from the Wichita stuff still there, so there might be. But that and the stockade there's an area they excavated in '66 that looks like it could be part of a stockade rather than a house. All these posts in a large area, so it would, not the corral stockade. So they had their horses were prime property. In fact, the Osage were coming all the way down from southwest Missouri and still raiding the Wichita for horses down here, so, on the Red River. So it's they had to graze them out, but during a battle they could keep them in the stockaded corrals. So. They even had problems with the Comanche stealing some of their horses. The Comanche were their allies. So. Horses were valued. But there's a number, probably one of the largest excavations in the 60s for a long time at that site, but they just barely touched the surface of it. It was that big. And the other site in the Arkansas River was close to that. There were 2 sites on there. They tended to be in paired villages in the 1800s, and like I said, the other villages across the river in Texas. And there's a third village that was supposedly not far downstream from this one on the Oklahoma side, but it's never been found. And I looked, so. But you can only look in certain areas. It's possible that it's been destroyed or something. But most of it, this is a pretty high terrace. So I don't think they'd camp down on that river. They'd grow stuff right down on the river bottom, but they probably didn't have any permanent villages down there. It's like today, you're going to get flooded. Nothing's down there really. They don't even keep fences down there anymore. So. In fact, it may look much like it did back then on the Texas side because it's scrub brush and then a woodland, and then you get up into the higher upland where then back into the prairie, which is basically what the Spanish described as they came down to that sandy flat. And that Wichita had a road cut through that woodland. A real smooth road, the Spanish described. broad and smooth roads. They had a trail to their village, really well kept on the Texas side. It may be that, oh, I know the visitors would, there was a visitor in 1808 who went to the longest site and then went over to the one on the scribes crossing the river to visit the other village. So they may have been to that other village too, so, the road. Funny, the Spanish don't describe the one on the Texas side at all. They either didn't see it or it wasn't, I don't know if it wasn't there at that time. For the longest time, until these excavations in the 60s, they thought the site was on the Spanish side, I mean on the Texas side. But all the descriptions match.